But one of the biggest factors that I think people miss is that construction workers were essential workers from the very beginning of the pandemic. So while plants and truckers and facilities were shutting down as part of the pandemic, we continued to consume inventory. We consumed throughout the whole pandemic. And so there was lots of material in the supply chain that got consumed during the early stages and the middle stages of the pandemic that those factories haven't been able to catch up and replace yet.
Welcome to Buzz House, a Baker Tilly podcast where you can find all the buzz around multifamily housing. I'm Don Bernards, the partner in charge of Baker Tilly's multifamily housing practice.
And I'm Garrett Gibson, a partner at Baker Tilly, also specializing in consulting on multifamily housing transactions across the country.
Each week, we'll bring you a guest or a topic in the multifamily housing industry that will help you win now and anticipate tomorrow. Let's get started. Our guest today in the Buzz House is Lowell Barron, owner of Fife Construction Company, as well as Vantage Development. We're going to have a discussion with Lowell, coming from his perspective as a general contractor, where things stand in today's environment. Before jumping into our discussion with Lowell today, we have a couple of items of industry news as we roll out of the holiday season into the new year. Many of you have seen the IRS has issued guidance, IRS Notice 2022-05, to extend key low-income housing tax credit program deadlines in light of the COVID-19 pandemic. These are around 10% test, place in service, as well as occupancy obligations. Just a few highlights, and there's a lot more, and we'll attach the notice so you can kind of get into the detail, or feel free to reach out to us. One, of course, is regarding the 10% test. For billing, they had a 10% requirement after April 1st of 2020 and before December 31st, 2020. That deadline is extended to the original deadline plus 2 years. If that original deadline is on or after January 1st, 2021 and before December 31st, 2022, that deadline is extended all the way to the end of December 31st, 2022. So I know that was a mouthful, but again, we'll put the notice. Just essentially know the 10% tests have been extended. Very similarly, I won't get into all the details, but place in service deadlines have been moved back. If you were, for example, if you originally close of calendar year 2020, the new deadline is actually all the way to the end of 2022. And there are, for newer allocations, extended all the way to 2023. So again, a lot of information. Really watch your deadlines when your original deadlines were required, and now what these new deadlines from 2022-05, the IRS notice. Finally, regarding occupancy, again, if you were saying maybe the end of 2021 was going to be your first tax credit period, you again have till the end of June of 2022 to fill in all your units, such that you would not have kind of year 15 or 15-year tax credits, kind of downward adjusters and so forth. That's very similar to what it was the year before. But again, if you have questions about that, around place in service, about leasing up, you do not get additional tax credits from a higher qualified, average occupancy applicable fraction in 2021. But again, just avoiding year 15 credits. So I know that's a lot, but again, we'll have the notice out there and you can reach out to us. One other bit of news I want to touch on is news from the Treasury with respect to the ARPA funds many people have been looking at and talking with municipalities about. The Department of Treasury issued a final rule for state and local fiscal recovery funds, which are authorized under the American Rescue Plan Act, or many people are calling ARPA, which of course provided $350 billion to state, local, and tribal governments to support their responses to and recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic. The ruling, the positive news for housing is the ruling outlines that affordable housing is an eligible use without further analysis or justification. So ARPA can in fact be used. That was just even one question. Can cities, counties use ARPA for affordable housing? That's a definite yes. However, the industry was asking for rules to make it easier to fit in within, especially affordable housing structures, financing structures. The Treasury rule did not make modifications that would make funding more compatible with LIHTC projects. Treasury's rules prohibit, in fact, the use of this funding as principal amounts on loans with maturities beyond 2026, which again, if you're familiar with LIHTC deals, a 4-year loan is really not going to be any good for your project. So the industry is looking at can be brought in as a grant, it could reduce basis, create taxable income. So just know that if you use ARPA funds in your affordable housing deal, they'll have to be carefully reviewed and structured, bringing these dollars into the project. So now, very, very excited to jump into our conversation with Lowell, and I can turn it over to Garrick to start with some questions with Lowell. Garrick?
Yeah, thank you, Don, as always, for providing that sort of intro with all that valuable information. But now we're jumping into our discussion with Lowell. Hey, we're very glad to have you join us on the Buzz House today. Before we get into the questions, we like our guests to start off by letting our listeners know a little bit about what you do and tell us a little about Fife Construction and the types of projects that you're working on.
Well, thanks, Garrick. Fife was incorporated in 1971. We're licensed or reciprocated license in 10 states, mostly affordable housing. We also build some hospitality. We do new construction. We do rehabilitation. We have a division of our organization that does site work for third parties, work for our own in-house development company. We competitively bid projects from time to time, depending on our backlog. So we cover a pretty broad spectrum of construction, 4 stories and less typically, unless it's a rehabilitation. We work mostly in the Southeast. We've looked at stuff outside the Southeast, but we haven't done much outside the Southeast. But, the greater Southeast is kind of our footprint.
Well, thanks for that, that information. I mean, it sounds like a lot of population growth is happening in those areas either way, right? And they're constantly getting hit by different hurricanes and whatnot. And so that kind of gets us into our discussion on the current state of construction, especially with supply chain issues. Now, obviously, I know you have the normal things going on, but we have this pandemic, right? Before we started a discussion early on this call, we kind of sighed and said, yeah, construction has been, a little difficult in recent times. So why don't you go ahead and just let us know about, what the reality is right now with all the supply chain issues going on, and maybe give us some examples.
Well, as we spoke earlier, construction right now is complicated. It's always complex, but right now it's complicated. The pandemic has cascaded into unfathomable places. You just can't imagine. We pride ourselves on being an organization that, thinks things through. Then what happens? Then what happens? Then what happens? Then what happens? And, we spend a lot of time mental modeling different problems and different projects. It's difficult to do. One example, we used to have a window manufacturing company, and so I happen to know a lot about the manufacturing of vinyl windows. During the pandemic, you've had production facilities shuttering lines from different periods of times. Hey, we need to clean the facility between shifts, so we can't have a third shift. So that took some production offline. Well, that's not just windows. That's the manufacturing of insulated glass units. That's the manufacturing of every piece and part that makes up a window. And every piece and part that makes up the equipment that makes the windows. The Teflon tape that goes in the window, the welders that welds the 2 pieces together. So you don't realize, when a production facility runs out of that Teflon tape, literally there's this big piece of metal that has a piece of Teflon over it that slides in between the 2 pieces of vinyl that gets them hot so it can stick them together. Well, when you run out of Teflon tape, you're done for the day. You really just can't make windows. So you had lines shutting down because of COVID and cleaning of COVID. You had shortages of different critical components. The material called swiggle that goes in between the insulated glass units that makes a lot of types of insulated glass units, that got in short supply. Resin that goes into the vinyl extrusion, that got in short supply. Locks, those are typically imported from China, that got in short supply because of import issues that were largely based on COVID. I mean, when the docks out west, shut down. So what does all that mean? You multiply all that together. Right now, window lead times are 12 to 16, 18 weeks. And we're not in the peak build season right now. We're in January when everything is normally slow. So what do those lead times balloon out to when we actually get into the peak building season? I don't know. It's going to be interesting to find out. And you've got folks who got burned last summer, contractors who got burned last summer, who are probably exhibiting a little bit of hoarding behavior. Hey, give me all the windows you got. Give them to me now, and I'll put them in a warehouse somewhere. So you've got hoarding behavior going on. You know, there's never a gas shortage until somebody says, wait a minute, I heard there was going to be a gas shortage, and then everybody goes and fills up their car with gas. How much of that is going on right now with OSB, with windows, with parts and pieces? How much of that is going on? It's a dynamic supply chain and a dynamic marketplace right now.
Thanks for that, Lowell. It's interesting. Well, last week I think you and I had talked about a couple things around labor and labor shortages, and you were, I mean, you kind of study this a lot. I mean, what are you seeing? You know, you as a general contractor, what can you tell our listeners about labor shortages that you're seeing?
Well, I think the headline number that everybody always looks at is unemployment. And I think that number is very important. But I think the critical number that people need to understand right now is the participation rate. So as unemployment has come down and down and down, we hit unprecedented levels of unemployment, the highest levels that we've had since we've been tracking it in this way since 1948. We tracked it in a different way before 1948. During the Great Depression, it was tracked a different way, but since 1948, it's highest levels of unemployment. The labor participation rate it was at an all-time low as far as fewest people participating in it since 1973. Not an all-time low since 1973. It was lower in 1973, but we were a different country in 1973. You had a lot of single wage households in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And, there were people that typically the wife was never planning on working. So she was in the demographic that could work, but she was just not working, not participating in the labor force. Currently, we still have tons of people. The labor participation rate is still very low. So even though unemployment is low, participation is low. So you've got about 4 million people that are missing out of the labor market. And they're not missing out of the $100,000 a year jobs. They're not missing at the top of the labor market. They're missing at the bottom. And there's all kinds of people that speculate all kinds of reasons, but why people are not participating. Some of them are scared. I don't want to I'm scared of the vaccine. I'm scared of the virus. I'm scared to go to work. I'm scared. There's lots of reasons why people at the bottom are not back participating in the labor market. But that's what's really impacting contractors is lack of the participation. When somebody walks off a job, it is difficult, if not impossible, to replace that person. It's complicated right now as an employer, as somebody who's got to get guys to dig holes and carry heavy stuff.
That makes a lot of sense, Lowell. Thanks for that insight. Well, just like everybody read now, inflation. Have you seen that hitting your materials, or how's it, or what's your take on, how's that affecting you?
Well, it's funny because when you talk about materials during the pandemic, everybody was talking about, well, what's it doing to prices? It was doing some stuff to prices, but it was mostly commodity-driven stuff, lumber. But it was lead times. And still, there are some items like windows. Windows, the lead time is ridiculous. The price is not ridiculous. It's just the lead time is ridiculous. So as far as inflation on some items, it's not real great. It's just the time that it takes to get them. Other items, your commodity-driven items, lumber is ridiculous. And lumber is such a, cellulose, wood fiber is such a backbone of so many other products. The paper on the outside of drywall, made out of cellulose, made out of wood fiber, comes out of a tree somewhere, some kind of tree. So you've got OSB, you've got plywood, you've got that lumber, soft lumber, number 2 pine, soft, spruce, soft lumber, number 2 pine, hard lumber, that are commodity driven, and those prices hit all-time highs last year. Everybody uses the word all-time high like it's normal. It's not normal. There were tariffs on softwoods coming in from Canada. Lots of factors. But one of the biggest factors that I think people miss is that construction workers were essential workers from the very beginning of the pandemic. So while plants and truckers and facilities were shutting down as part of the pandemic, we continued to consume inventory. We consumed throughout the whole pandemic. And so there was lots of material in the supply chain that got consumed during the early stages and the middle stages of the pandemic that those factories haven't been able to catch up and replace yet.
Interesting analysis, Lowell. Look, before we wrap up, I wanted to see if you can comment on whether or not you're seeing any new construction technology or innovation out there. I know generally we see some incremental change with energy efficiency or new construction processes. I was wondering if you can comment on whether or not you're seeing some substantial differences in some construction technology that's coming down the road.
Construction is kind of like blue jeans. There's bell bottoms, and then there's tights, and then there's these fads that come through the construction industry. SIP panels, modular, and they come and go. They come every couple of decades. They come around because somebody believes they've figured out a cheaper, better way of building a unit. And there may be some. Sometimes there's just some poor price discovery, and there may be a cheaper, better way of building the unit. But at the end of the day, the way we build them, 2x4s with sheetrock, and in most areas of the country, that's the cheapest way to get it done. I mean, that's what price discovery will tell you. I do think, though, I've spent time researching, it sounds crazy, but robots that hang drywall. I personally have spent time looking at robots that paint, because there are some out there that, there's 3D printing concrete structures. There's folks that are scratching around the edges of trying to figure out cheaper, better ways. The electric car, is a different way of getting places. So us as a company, and I think the entire industry, we're always looking for innovation, but unfortunately, we figured out how to do it about as cheap as it can get done over the last millennia. Since we've been building stuff, since old boys started stacking rocks on top of each other, we figured out a pretty cheap way of getting it done. I would love to see some innovation around areas like drywall, like paint, where machines could be brought into the workforce to improve production, and those workers, those people are going to be out of a job. No, we'll find something else for them to do. We got other places they can work, but those innovations would be very timely.
Lowell, really want to thank you for joining us today. Really insightful, and listeners want to thank you for tuning in today as well.
Yeah, thanks.
Hey, thanks, guys.
Thank you for listening to Buzz House. To receive a notification when new episodes are available, please subscribe to Buzz House, a Baker Tilly podcast, wherever you get your podcasts. For additional resources around multifamily housing, check out bakertilly.com. And if you have a suggested topic, please send them to build@bakertilly.com. That's BUILD @bakertilly.com.